with that, I will get out of the way. Please welcome Stanton Stevens.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Ed. And thanks for coming. I love having the excuse to talk to you all and the excuse to go research this wonderful material and read Lawrence's writings and Bailey's and the Theosophical works and try to bring them to you in some personalized form after I've made an attempt to build it into something for everybody. This information, I just want to say a little bit about where it all comes from. I'm particularly drawing from Lawrence's material, and it's been translated from Swedish, and as Ed mentioned, there are 3 new chapters, which I'm very excited about. Culture, Theology, and Religion, they're entitled. And about 20 years ago, I was visiting my grandfather in Sweden, and he introduced me to the translator, Lars Edelsko, who is still busily translating. And ever since then, it's been my privilege, and not many people who know about Lawrence's material, so it's really been wonderful for me to be able to get to know it and try to share it. It's all online, and if there's one thing you get out of this talk, I hope it is that this is an interesting thing to go investigate. You can print it out for yourself, Ed, and through the library here, you can get a copy of all of the PDFs on a thumb drive or something like that, so that you can have it for your own, or just go look at it online. It's also given freely. That's a wonderful thing about it. You know, it's all offered free online. And I likewise give my information freely here. And you know, when I'm talking, the money that you put in the basket there all goes to support the Theosophical Society here. So I encourage you to be generous, and I put some money in there too, because I just want this to continue. I love this venue. And of course the library, I need to spend some time here. Every time I look, I think, oh, I just want to sit down and read this. So, and one more thing I want to say about the sources. When you consider how much we can know as human beings, there are some serious limitations. And it's hard to even know how to verify what you hear. But the important concept that really resonates with me from esoterics is that we are advancing and that there is a path of the evolution of consciousness. That's what esoterics says it's all about. Evolution of consciousness, and as our consciousness evolves, we move right on through the human kingdom and beyond. That humanity is not the apex of evolution. Let's hope not, considering how we handle things. It goes on quite a bit further into reaches we can't even fathom, because it's evolution of consciousness and new kinds of consciousness and ways of perceiving are ahead of us. We'll all get there. We're all going there. But those who've gone far beyond us have reached the place beyond the human, beyond the poor lonely spot that is humanity, where we have such a hard time even communicating with each other. The next level of consciousness is another thing entirely, where the beings there, love and brotherhood and understanding amongst each other is simply a given. It's just the nature of their existence. They work together with perfect harmony because they understand they're all one. It's simply the reality for those who've moved beyond human. As hard as that might be for us to understand, we look at how humans operate with each other. But those beings, they look at us, and they've been here, and they have compassion for humanity. And so with that in mind, they want to help us, and what they can do for us, they can't force us to be enlightened. They can't violate our free will and our necessary work that we do to wake up, but they can give us information. That's really the source of the information in Lawrence's work, in Bailey's work, in Theosophy. It's from the elder brothers, they're called, or the ascended masters is a bit more of a glamorous term, but really it's just those who have moved to the next level, beyond human. It's logical to me that they must exist because of the continuum, and if they do, and it really is all about love, of course they have this to offer us and give us. So it makes sense that we wouldn't be left in the dark. So, speaking of being in the dark about things, this topic of this talk is nonsense. And there's so much of it around us, and I'll go through some of the different kinds and how you can maybe approaches to dealing with the nonsense of the world and our own self-created nonsense. But before we do that, there's an exercise that I feel is, every talk I like to start with this. I think it's a good focusing exercise. And if this exercise and looking up Lawrency were the two things you got out of this talk, I'd be very happy. We, as I mentioned at the evolution of consciousness, all of us worked hard to get where we are in terms of the consciousness we have. In fact, according to Lawrency and esoterics, we've worked our way through the lower kingdoms of nature to get here. As our fundamental point of consciousness selves, we've had to work our way through the mineral kingdom, where consciousness was just passive, purely experiential. Then we had to work our way through the vegetable kingdom, which is subjective consciousness, and a sort of dreamlike consciousness, only aware of the plant is aware only of its own body. It doesn't have sense organs observing the rest of the world. It's subjectively aware as it reaches for the light. And then consciousness graduates from that kingdom to the next with a very distinct change to objective consciousness in the animal kingdom, where we can observe, and we can move, and we can interact with other beings. That's such a huge shift. Well, naturally, there's going to be a big shift to get to human, and this is what differentiates animals and humans, is the shift in consciousness. We have animal-style bodies. No one really argues with that. But we're not animals, and the reason is our kind of consciousness. As human beings, we are capable of self-consciousness. And as soon as an animal can actually reach that point, often through being our pet, they have the experiences that finally give them that aha moment, and it's a very huge thing for an animal to achieve a level of self-consciousness. When that happens, they're not animals anymore. They don't reincarnate as animals. The next time the door opens for the incarnation to the human kingdom, that's what they'll be doing. And we've been through that. Now, self-consciousness we don't actually use as much as we might. We are too often the victims of our own automatic thinking. Thoughts that come up because they've always come up. It's always been our response. When somebody does this, we do that. There's not an actual consciousness of choosing to do that. But when we make those automatic responses, we so often regret it. And so often it involves people we love, that we're responding to in an angry or short-tempered way or something like that. The fact is, if we were simply a little bit more aware of where that response came from, we wouldn't do that. So being self-conscious is a way to improve your life. And since esoterics also tells us that everything in our lives is the result of our choices, we're creating happiness, unhappiness, whatever for ourselves continually through choices of what we pay attention to, where we're going to give our attention. So let's be aware of our attention. Where the attention is where the self is. So if you can just take a moment to consider where the attention, what your attention is on, not just that, but who is paying the attention right now? Where is the source of this attention? That's the self. And you're being truly self-conscious when you're aware of your consciousness. Well, now that we've perhaps taken a moment to celebrate our humanity that way, that's the great achievement of humanity, is to really fulfill our self-conscious nature. Just a little spoiler alert as to the next kingdom. Of course, there's another huge consciousness shift to get there. And just like we made the big consciousness shift to self-consciousness from animal, the shift at the end of the human kingdom is the shift to collective consciousness. In the next kingdom, next cycle for us beyond human, we share consciousness. And as you can imagine, sharing consciousness requires certain things. We're not really welcome to share consciousness when our consciousness is full of a completely self-centered view of the universe. Nobody really wants to share consciousness with that. That's a very human way to be. We're done being human when we don't when we're done being self-centered, when we're really functioning on the level of what's best for everybody is best, and I'm operating on that level, then you're ready to transcend self to some degree and move on to the next kingdom where it's, from everything that we've read about it, some people perhaps have experienced this to some degree here, but when you're in this realm of complete shared consciousness, there's no more loneliness, and there's certainly no reason to suffer over separation. The idea of death doesn't occur because you've got continuity of consciousness in the next kingdom. We don't need to keep renewing this form as a separate being to learn. So, something to look forward to. Back to the nonsense. We're exposed to so much of it, and I had to wonder, do people really want to hear very much about nonsense? But nonsense is actually kind of funny, I think. The things we come up with, the humanity throws at itself, are really just, why do we do that? And one thing that struck me is it just wastes so much of our time, the fact that we've got nonsense coming at us from all directions all the time. We've got to keep choosing, no, I'm not buying that, no, I'm not going to believe that, come on, What if imagine a world where we didn't actually have to choose through all the stuff all the time? That'd be a very different place. If the information offered to us was actually, if not immediately of use, at least accurate, at least we could say, well, how about that? I learned something. You don't get to say that often in this listening to the things we hear. So let's consider some of the big nonsense categories. And you can just start with what people want. Lots of nonsense gets wrapped around that. People want to be happy. Well, there's certainly plenty of people who'd like to help you be happy for a fee. And they have products that will make you happy. They have books and they have everything it might take to make you happy. And it's such a big process of convincing people of nonsense. It must be a tough thing to be an ad executive and review your conscience every so often. People want love, and of course, really the only thing standing between us and a good love relationship is a good deodorant. Everybody knows that. Oh wait, I must have believed some nonsense to say that. Or the right clothes, or the right car, or the right blah, 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 blah. There's nonsense in the terms of the classes of people, the ways that people try to divide others and say, well, I'm of this superior, I went to Ivy League, whatever. It's not, I really am relieved to be on the West Coast because of all that. When I went to school on the East Coast, there's so much more of that for the fraternities and stuff. The West Coast, there's a bit more respect for everybody as individuals. There's still plenty of class stratification, but really, I think most of what you get exposed to day to day is commercial nonsense. And there was a really striking example of that the other day. We had this beautiful spiritual holiday, Thanksgiving. Yet Black Friday is encroaching upon it. It's creeping back in all the way into Thanksgiving itself, and now it starts at 6 p.m. on Thanksgiving, and people are expected to show up to work to sell people stuff. We're kind of losing the balance on that one. It's going in the direction of nonsense there. Here's a particularly insidious species of nonsense out there. Are you safe? Are you secure? Security is a human need. We need to know we're safe in our homes or in public. But this kind of nonsense breeds more of itself. We're not very good at figuring out the odds of bad things happening to us. So when we see on the news that somebody was attacked by somebody in public at a mall 2,000 miles away in a country of 300 million people, we do feel like that could happen to us the next day, And so the infinitesimal odds don't matter to us. We just react on the level of, oh my gosh, I can't have it happen. And so we have people that, they're convinced, I must have a gun. How can I be safe unless I can threaten someone's life? That's the insane logic behind that. Or, Obama wants to take our guns away. I need a gun to protect my gun. So nonsense is breeding more all the time. And in fact, the sad thing here is that nonsense has successfully bred out to the point where the United States, with 4.5% of the world's population, owns half of the privately held guns in the world. We're arming ourselves to the teeth against something we've manufactured. You know, this fear level we've manufactured. And it's just so silly, you know. Guns just make everything more dangerous, you know. They get used. People get angry. We're not in control of our emotions as much as we'd like. And they're used for suicides. It's horrible. They're used for, you know, they're stolen. And then they end up in totally the wrong hands. It's just getting out of control. I mean, there's an estimate that by 2015, gun deaths will be a greater number than automobile accident deaths in this country. And that's, when are we going to wake up? Anyway, there's momentum to, like, this nonsense is like a cancerous kind of nonsense that grows. And there's also vested interest that sustains nonsense. You know, when you've got a corporation with billions of dollars at stake, they don't want you to suddenly wake up and go, wait, you know, I don't actually need to have a car that costs 5 times as much as one that works just as well for me. No. You know, staying in the dark about that is something that is actively promoted. I have to wonder about the cause and effects on the people that promote that kind of nonsense. You know, are they born into a world where they just can't tell the difference between a $100,000 car and a $20,000 car? It's just, you know, they've lied to so many people about it, they themselves can't tell anymore. It's, you know, commercial nonsense, we're all fairly familiar with it. And even as a kid watching TV, I knew that commercials were trying to manipulate me. But as bad as all that is, it's nothing compared to how bad nonsense can really get. It was only 200-300 years ago that we finally overcame nonsense that ruled the world. Religious dogma, for which if you simply chose to state an opinion contrary to the dogma of the times, you could be charged with heresy and burnt at the stake. And this is the sad thing about it, is that Christianity, that we, you know, with such a beautiful ideal behind it, and the founder that was, you know, a being such as we've not seen since, to come in and teach this lesson of brotherhood and love, and then have it turned into what became, what Lawrence says, the most barbarous force preventing human progress, as you can imagine, that it was really hijacked by people with exactly the opposite intentions and stayed that way for 1,000 years, and that there are 50 million victims to Christianity. 50 million people give up their lives fighting nonsense, trying to be something other than what the Christian church forced them to be. And even recently there was a court decision about this idea, you know, of religious ideals, where the judge said, well, there's a kernel of truth to it, so I can't really criticize that. And it just shows where we're willing to support nonsense with nonsense arguments. There's a kernel of truth to every pile of nonsense. You can justify anything with that logic. It's interesting that humanity has managed to change. The humanists, the people that are supporting humans being humane, have managed to change Christianity over time. They finally succeeded, and now Christianity is claiming them as their own, as its own. The humanists, even though the humanists basically usually died in the process of trying to change Christianity. Now Christianity looks back and says, well, you wouldn't have all this good, nice behavior, human behavior, if it wasn't for Christianity. Well, and this is hard for me to read. You know, I was raised a nominally Christian faith, but Lawrence, I have to warn you, if you're going to read Lawrence, he withholds no punches when it comes to these organized groups who are suppressing human life and love and freedom to think. He is just, here's a fascinating thing he points out, that Martin Luther, who stood up to rebel against the Christianity of the times that was so far gone that it was selling, this is in 1517, it was selling indulgences, saying, give us some money and your sins are forgiven. Okay, how big a sin? Cost you more, but yeah, we can forgive that one. So, of course, people thought that was ridiculous, but that was actually the Orthodox Christianity at the time that was so bad had gotten to the point where it was weak. It was starting to be ridiculous to everybody. And there was a good possibility it was about to falter and fail and be replaced with something a lot better. But when Martin Luther stood up and launched his Protestant movement, it actually crystallized the Catholic side of things and the Protestant, the battles and the endless, the fighting and the Inquisitions and all the things that came out of that were partly because it was finally opposed. And you couldn't laugh at it anymore. It had this enemy, and the enemies had to fight. And Lawrence actually says that Martin Luther set things back for humanity by 200 years. And what he came up with didn't offer that many advantages either. I mean, according to Lawrence, it was based throughout the Pope idea. And so the Bible is what you've got. Everything is based on the Bible. But now everybody interprets the Bible differently, and that's why there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of Protestant, schism-related Protestant churches. And they don't have any central authority that can change its mind. At least the Pope can say, well, actually, we're changing the dogma. And if the Pope says so, that's the way it goes. And here's a fascinating thing. We got Mitt Romney running for president last time. People are trying to classify the Mormon church. Well, what is this church? Is it Protestant? Is it Catholic? And in some ways, it's both. It actually has its own Pope, which gives it flexibility. That gives it this particular advantage. It has a prophet. It doesn't call it, it hates the idea of a pope. But the prophet of the Mormon church can declare something to be different any time. So it gives it flexibility that might help it outlast the Catholic Church if that's desirable. But when some dogma gets so repulsive that it threatens the existence of an organization, then it's nice that there's some power at the top, like the Mormon prophet who decided that, we're going to change this idea that blacks are lesser humans. It's really just not working for us. And he changed it. Just a comment from Lawrence on Buddhism. He says the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, that is true to the original Buddhism. But not much else, because of a tendency of teachers to say, well, this is a very wise thing. And Buddha was a very wise person. And being so wise, of course, he must have said it. Therefore, Buddha said it. So we have quite an accumulation of stuff around Buddhism, but he says it's held to its original origins much better than, say, Christianity. In general, religion is kind of a breeding ground for nonsense because it's based on belief, and belief is an emotionally based thing. Belief is you believe or you don't. It's black and white. It's when you get into the mental levels, you get grayscales and perspective and shades of maybe it's not so clear. But religion is not about mentality so much. So that was a big category of nonsense, the dogma. And so thank goodness, the humanists of the world continue to pray, may the church never again have the power it had. Of course, we do see, Islamic situations that are pretty ugly with the church having a lot of power. But hopefully that will fade. Another big source of nonsense is that people really don't think as much as they might want to if they thought about it. George Bernard Shaw said, few people think more than 2 or 3 times a year. I've made an international reputation for myself by thinking once a week. When esoteric says that our lives and our happiness and our situations are all the result of our choices, it makes it pretty clear that the large number of happy people have made some pretty bad choices. And you would hope that there could be some more thinking. I mean, people get in and out of relationships without really thinking. It's emotionally driven. You need to get the mind involved. You need to get the heart involved. Gandhi, he prayed for his people to have good mentality. I was very struck by that. He knew he was coming to a crisis area in India. I pray these people will be, think. The Dalai Lama I saw recently on a presentation, when he was asked what to pray for, he said, good critical thinking that can look at the world and take action. That's not praying for God to go fix everything, which I thought was a big improvement over some approaches. So when it comes to thinking, we're advancing. Humanity, you can't do the most menial of jobs in this country without interacting with a computer these days. You've got to punch in and out of this and sign into that and interact with. It's being compelled now that everybody's got to think more. Maybe that's not the ideal kind of thinking, but let's hope that in general, the assistance of the internet, we can get some higher quality thinking. Because I'm with the zombies on this one. More brains. Okay, another category of nonsense that we seem to be moving beyond to some degree, I hope, is philosophical nonsense. When you have someone say, the physical reality is all an illusion, it's all in our heads, it's not really real, we live in this, it's subjective, there's no objective reality, it's all subjective. Well, this is the problem with the mental approach. You can slice and dice and come up with the justification, rationale, and philosophical argument that will support that. But really, this is real, and I'm real, and you're real. And if anybody's really going to argue with that, then you're not going to get far. And what Lawrence says is the dismissing of the physical plane as an illusion, which is part of some philosophies from India. He says that's a tremendous mistake, especially in the West. Western thinkers want to come from a material basis. When they figure out how everything works, they want to acknowledge the realities of the physical world. Dismissing it all as an illusion just isn't really helpful. It's so real that what Lawrence says is the most important plane for us as human beings is the physical plane. When we're here in these bodies is when we make progress. In between lives is resting, Maybe it's working up and thinking through the experiences you've had to see if you can gain something, but it's right here in a physical body in this world is the only place you make actual progress. And that's partly because this world is so very real. The emotional world, the mental world, in those worlds we command the matter with our thoughts and our feelings. It takes the shape we want. In between incarnations, we live in fantastic worlds that we've created around us, out of the material of those planes. In this world, it's not so easy. We can't just command everything to change and be what we want it to be. We have to learn a lot to really change things in this world and figure out how we're going to work with it without friction. So that's how we have the opportunity to learn. So the idea that truth can't be known is another philosophical problem that's out there. The people saying, well, nobody really knows the truth, it's all relative. But that idea taken too far just robs us of our common sense. And Lawrence says our common sense is precious. That's really that's the digested results of our experience. And if we're not trusting our common sense, especially if we're just talking it away with philosophical nonsense, we're rejecting our ability to make wise choices entirely. So, what about nonsense for ourselves? I mean, the truth for ourselves. Our world is emotionally focused, mentally focused. In both of those realms, emotional and mental, are realms of manufactured illusions, the glamours of the emotional world, the illusions of the mental world. Anchoring ourselves in a common sense, physical world reality is really important. And most of us here are probably more on the mental side of things. We wouldn't be interested in a talk like this if we weren't thinkers. So we have another direction that sometimes we can go too far in. And the mind, like I was saying, it can take you into subjectivist philosophies and all kinds of areas when really it needs to be complemented by the heart. The heart has been called in esoterics the touchstone of truth. And in thinking about that, I think that basically means that if you bring your heart into your thinking, it can just tell you as a basic sense of, is this baloney or not? It can tell you pretty quickly, whereas sometimes thinking about it isn't enough. Common sense is a good thing, thinking is a good thing, and they both should serve the deep spiritual desires of the heart, is what I read out of esoterics. Interesting, I saw a program recently that said the heart has an electromagnetic radiation that is greater than any other part of your body. And that two people, you can attach measuring devices to a person and measure somebody standing a good distance away from someone else. You can measure the heartbeat of one person in the other person's energy field, that it has that broad an impact. So that brings it down into something rather concrete. So on to the types of nonsense. One more type to talk about, political nonsense. Everybody's so familiar with that. But there's one little take on it. I mean, Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government there is, except for all the others. And we tend to say, okay, well, democracy is the best, then let's just use democracy to decide what's true. Well, that's where we get in trouble. Because just because most people support some idea does not make it true. Most people are wrong about most things, basically. But if you look at it on the whole, you could look at leaders we've elected and things like that. Democracy is not the way to separate truth from falsehood. This has to be your own choice. And relying on, well, everybody says that, so I'm going to believe it, that's going to be a painful lesson when that works out. And another big part of the nonsense is we don't even elect somebody unless they promise things that are impossible to deliver. We accepted that the candidate has to promise all these things, and then I like his nonsense better than his nonsense. It's pretty much how we approach elections. So who's going to go out there without nonsense? We don't vote for him. It's funny how accepted that is. So how do we take on the nonsense? React to it in some way that's helpful or at least saves us some trouble. Well, you've got to face the fact that nonsense is really a lie. It's, to give it an uglier word, it's out of harmony with reality. We don't hold anybody accountable for that. Corporations, the beef industry suing Oprah Winfrey because she said she'd never eat another hamburger. In Texas, there's a law against criticizing beef. And she had to spend millions of dollars defending herself against this lawsuit. But has that changed? No. Governments, recently a political campaign posted some billboard or something. There was a lie, a great big lie about, statistics say that our opponent, blah, is false. So somebody actually took them to court and said, is this a lie? Can't we do something about this outright lie? And the court said, we agree it's a lie. But it's not illegal to lie, so we can't do anything. But at least they had a court agreeing it was a lie, so I hope that helped them. We don't take corporations to account for lying. They do it all the time. We accept it. We accept it from our politicians and our businesses. And Lawrence actually had a good suggestion for politics, a political ombudsman who's neutral, who actually had the power to penalize campaigns or candidates or parties for lying and slandering each other. And I think that's a great idea. Well, that's the problem. Can you really find an honest, are we going to be like Diogenes holding the lantern out? Where's an honest ombudsman? Honest man. So even we don't really hold ourselves all that accountable either, because when we really want to do something we know is not the best thing for us, we rationalize it. We make a rational lie and rationalize it. That's usually the case of the emotional needs running the show and telling the mind, come up with an excuse for me because I really want to do this. Whereas the mind really ought to be running the show. It's the higher level consciousness. And of course, as I say, working with the heart to not be too coldly mental, but still, the mind ultimately is what takes charge of emotions. The toughest thing about facing lies and nonsense is really being honest with yourself. And if we all did a better job of that, probably we'd tolerate less of it out there and the world would change. Lawrence says a fascinating thing about this that has been a benefit to me. He says that in any situation, what you end up doing will be the result of the strongest motivation. That's what wins. It's not necessarily the thing you swore you would do. or that you're committed to do, or that you say, I'm really next time, it's the strongest motivation. That's going to trump everything else. So the wise man, says Lawrence, builds motivations, strengthens the motivations to do the things that you really actually want to do. So if you want to change a behavior, strengthen your motivation to do the new behavior. And the way you do that is by imagining the results, the good results of the new behavior vividly, and building a desire to actually achieve those results and be in that place and be the person who now does things this way. To build that desire to the point where that is going to be what you do because you want it more. It's an interesting self-improvement technique. We have some other prospects for addressing nonsense because now we can look up anything on the internet. And it's such a double-edged sword. We can go get some good information. We can read Lawrence. On the other hand, we can find exactly what reinforces our worst opinion. We can find a whole group of people that believe the same nonsense and feel like we have great camaraderie in our nonsense and carry on in the wrong direction with it. And speaking of the internet and in general entertainment, this is where a kind of nonsense comes in that is fascinating. We experience reality day to day. We're driving our cars, we're doing our jobs, whatever. But so much of the more dramatic experiences of reality are secondhand through movies, stories, books. We're experiencing it filtered through someone else's point of view. So it's secondhand reality, and it's never really perfectly like reality. The people that write the books and make the movies, for one thing, they haven't read any Lawrence. They don't know about reincarnation. They don't know about the laws of life. If they make something that is in line with reality, it's because they're intuitively guided, and they're doing a pretty good job of it sometimes. And you can actually find some very good material that is like reality, but when we treat that material as reality, when we go to the violent movies and, oh, the world's a violent place, or we go to tragedies and it resonates with our victim status, that people have such tragedies in their life, when really life is a triumph. No matter what gets thrown at you, you have the opportunity to achieve and grow and learn, and that's what it's all about. Whatever appears to be unfortunate is playing a very important role in our lives. Our beliefs about things like true love are shaped almost entirely by media and stories. Our beliefs about what we would, dying for love or dying in battle or in the ideals for which we fight and things like that, they've all come secondhand through somebody else. We end up pretty far removed from our own experience and our own common sense. So that's an area of nonsense that maybe we're not that aware of, but it's, when we look at learning from life, we often end up with this idea that we're succeeding or failing in life. But both succeed and fail are defined by stories. Someone made up stories that we read, or our parents maybe gave us stories about what it means to succeed, what it means to fail. We've made up our own stories about it. We process all of our experiences through stories, even if they're just our own. Everything we go through is important and valuable. It adds to what we've got. It'll build our common sense and experience. Oh, thank you. So we're too quick to label things failures. We're so susceptible when we're children. And I'm sure that deep in my consciousness somewhere is some idea I've got from a Disney movie about what's really important or what it means to be a man, for instance. That gets defined in movies, Will we ever dig those out? I don't know. I wonder if I've dug all those things out. It takes certain experiences, and that's one reason, life is an experimental thing. You run into your own preconceptions from trying to do some things. Here's an example. Goldilocks. What a story. Breaking and entering. Those bears didn't have an alarm system, so Goldilocks went right in. Ate their food and broke their furniture. What kind of story is that for kids? I found one particular teacher out there really addresses the self-deception angle of things. Byron Katie. And I hope you all got the handout, because I've got some good quotes in there. On the second page, there's some quotes by Byron Katie. I am a lover of what is, not because I'm a spiritual person, but because it hurts when I argue with reality. Here's a good one. Don't believe everything you think. And it's actually, to elaborate on that one, a thought is harmless unless we believe it. It's not our thoughts, but our attachment to our thoughts that causes suffering. Attaching to a thought means believing it's true without inquiring. A belief is a thought that we've been attaching to, often for years. So it's a very wise thing she suggests, questioning our thoughts. Did that conclusion come from a Disney movie? The reason I think that's so important. So we're not required to be in the dark. Truth, meaning an accurate description of reality, is out there. And the best presentation I've found for our Western consciousness, our modern day consciousness, is in Lawrency. So I, again, encourage you, if you want to read somebody who just doesn't hold back and says the way things are, he's really not worried about offending anybody. You have to be aware of that. If you have a belief that you can be offended because someone is contradicting it, he'll probably do that. But he himself is also not really, it's not so much his opinion as he's trying to accurately describe reality. And that's different than a philosophy, it's different than a story. It's a description. That's the best information you can have, is something that just describes what is. It's not, when we look at how nonsense is affecting us, it's not life doesn't hold us back. It's not, certainly not God holding us back. That's the more nonsense that we believe too often, is that, we're sinners and blah, 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 things that got incorporated from religious things. It's our own beliefs. And so we need to be considering, is this, like Byron Katie says, is this a belief that is at the core of my actions, or is it from something I know? Common sense and beliefs are not necessarily the same thing. It's good to distinguish the two. We can't help but achieve the goal. We're promised that by esoterics. I think that's true. Which means we are going to have to face everything we believe that's nonsense at some point. But we don't have to be so dramatically self-doubting about it that we're going to hurt ourselves. Allow some time for it, be loving, come from your heart. Sure, we're going to find doubts and find problems in ourselves' beliefs, but it's important not to completely destabilize ourselves and throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's going to be a gradual process, and I'm just encouraging people to be heart-minded about themselves as well as everyone else. I mean, a lot of us have suffered quite a bit in the fact that we actually do know a few things. If we've had incarnations where we went to esoteric mystery schools and we learned some of the facts of reality, to come into this world and live in the school systems and have the nonsense thrown at us is a really disorienting thing. There are souls that can spend a whole incarnation and never recover their old level from a previous incarnation because, they're kind of brutalized by the nonsense of this world. There's a big section in the handout about how Lawrence's opinion of how education can change to improve messing up people's lives. And also Lawrence gives high praise to an approach that is particularly American, interestingly enough. American philosophers, Emerson, Mulford, Trine, Marden, and Whitman, he praises. And I've got at the end, I think it's the last quotes in that handout, are a couple of quotes from his discussion of those American philosophers' philosophy. He says, this is the good replacement for the dogmatic, God will punish you kind of thinking. This is a philosophy of if it supports growth, if it supports unity, if it supports active, living progress, then it's good. If it limits, divides, squelches life, denies people their own individuality, then it's bad. It's a fairly clear-cut sort of thing, and it is basically derived from the New Testament, but what Christ actually said and not a bunch of interpretations made after the fact. So I encourage you to read that. You can get the whole section online. Here's another aspect of emphasizing truth versus nonsense. Lying is really planting not a very good seed. I mean, I'm a Sagittarius, okay, so I'm compulsively honest. This is part of my nature, and sometimes it's a little brutal. I'm sorry if I'm too frank with things, but I also have a really difficult time lying about anything. And when I've tried as a young person, it was such a miserable failure that I've given up completely. I don't lie about anything, and I feel better for it. As Mark Twain said, if you don't lie, you don't have to remember anything. You know, that's an advantage. But it wasn't that long ago that when somebody was terminally ill, the doctor would go to the family and say, "Should we tell him? You know, he's got enough problems already. Do you think we should tell him whether he's dying? I don't know. What do you think?" And that's a kind of, it's considered a white lie, right? But I just think that's terribly destructive. And that if you're not being told the truth by the people you love, how are you going to figure this world out? You know, if you can't trust the people you love to at least be honest with you, if they're going to try to soften reality with stories for you, how are you going to make it? So hopefully that's a thing of the past. I think that shows a little bit of evolution, and doesn't it? That doctors don't do that anymore. They will tell people if they're dying, I think. I think that's been an improvement. But in general, a white lie is planting a little seed of something that guarantees that you're not exactly going to hear the truth yourself at some point. If you want to hear the truth and you want to be able to tell if someone's telling you the truth, you need to be a truth teller yourself. So Lawrence C. lists, as far as lies go, what's not true, what's taught, the great awful things that have been taught by Christianity, which, you know, those are the most dangerous lies, the religious lies that we built into our system as kids. And I thought I could just read off, and then they're just a bunch of horrible things. So I decided, with Valerie's good advice, that it's much better to put it in form of a question. Like, look what John Lennon did. You know, he said, what if there is no heaven? What if there is no hell? You know, imagine that. So imagine that there are no sacred books. That's what Buddha's always taught. There are no sacred books. Books aren't sacred. The ideas behind aren't even sacred. The ideas are their attempts to convey to us the realities. The realities, everything is sacred when it comes to what's real. But ideas about it, worshiping them, worshiping books. What if everybody knew that God was all about love? Not wrath, not jealousy, not any of that nonsense, but about love. What if everybody knew that? I had no idea until I was much older than a child what good fortune I had as a child to be raised in the Church of Religious Science. That is, as religions go, it's very benign. It may not have a lot of this good information. That's what I really wanted, and I couldn't find it there. But at least it told you that God is love and you are loved. What if we weren't afraid of God? What a terrible thing to be afraid of God. And God really, in esoterics, we're talking about God. We're talking about the united consciousness of every being further than humanity. The great, vast consciousness, intelligences, and divine lords of planets or solar systems or galaxies, whatever, all in their united consciousness. The idea of God, I guess, that's about as close as you can get in esoterics to an idea of God. You know, monotheism has a few problems in that definition. What if Satan was never invented? Because he certainly is an invention. And what does God need him for anyway? You know, what's the sense in God setting up some sparring partner? You know, Satan. You know, God's supposed to have made everything anyway, so then he comes up with a Satan too just for fun? This is a silly idea. What What if there's no heaven, no hell below us? What if? Don't we all harbor a little bit of the pictures of hell? We get lots of those pictures. We just got back from Europe, and boy, anybody who goes to the cathedral can see the poor souls being tossed down into hell and prodded by demons, and it stays in the human consciousness for a long time. What if we let go of the idea of divine punishment? The laws of nature take everything back to balance. They work on every being. Every being we might want to call God is subject to the laws of nature. And sowing and reaping is always taken care of and works out, and that's how the universe maintains its balance. It would all be chaos without these laws. We don't have to have some personalized punishment for people. Their actions come back to them exactly in proportion to what they know they've done. What if we accepted that we're responsible for our actions and their consequences, that there's no instant forgiveness? What a strange idea grafted into Christianity, that you could be somehow made, all your consequences taken away from you and put on somebody else. What a way to dodge responsibility. You've got all kinds of, from mafia dons and all sorts, I guess I'll convert and repent on my deathbed and everything will be fine. I don't know about that. So, what if we accepted that no higher being gives us any orders? That we got the laws already. They act independently of any being ordering us about. Lawrence emphasizes this, that no higher being has any intention of commanding us to do anything, and certainly doesn't want to be worshipped by us. That's such a human projection. What if we protected the truth and not expected God to? The idea that God protects the writing in the Bible so it's always sacred. That's really up to us. It always has been. What if we didn't expect God to do things for us that we could do for ourselves? Because Lawrence emphasizes that God is not going to do anything for us that we can do for ourselves. That doesn't help anybody to do for them what they can do for themselves, even when we're raising kids. What if we were never kicked out of the Garden of Eden? We were just blind to it. We are just blind to it. What if we saw life as a series of opportunities and suffering as a lesson in compassion? That's the whole point of the suffering, really. If we can learn compassion from it. What if we stopped listening to people who claim to know the will of God? Well, I promised you a story. Some of you are on the mailing list. This is a story about my family, an endless source of interesting stories, it turns out. Some of you are familiar with the Rainbow Bridge book. That was a creation by my grandparents, Norman and Josephine Stevens. Now, Josephine was Norman's second wife. My blood grandmother was Winona, Norman and Winona Stevens. And they had a fascinating life. Norman lived to 103, and the things that he went through all along the way. The Rainbow Bridge book came out when he was 85. It was a result of a whole life of seeking and studying and experimenting. But along the way, there were things like World War II and the Great Depression that made for interesting stories in his life too. Norman was in World War I, joined the Balloon Corps, and instead of getting shipped off to the end of World War I to Europe, he got to go to California to train others for the Balloon Corps. The rest of his group that he was with in Maine when that started, they all went to Europe and died. But the universe had different plans for Norman. He went to California, was in the military there, and went to a dance, and he met Winona. They got engaged. They were a lovely couple. I have some really old pictures of them. And 2 weeks before they were about to be married, she gave him some news. She said, "I've got to tell you something. I just inherited $20 million. And this was in 1919. That's a vast amount of money back then. Turns out she was the only child of Arthur and Theophila. Theophila was actually my great-grandmother's name. Arthur and Theophila Bassett. And he was an inventor who'd invented a way to automate the making of nails and tacks and sold it to U.S. Steel and made a vast amount of money. So there they were, getting married with tons and tons of money. He wasn't from a wealthy family, didn't really have much experience with that. But they didn't know what to do with all that money, basically. They were, they wanted to have kids, and so they went ahead and had kids. They started a family. That made everybody happy. But what do you do when you're sitting on a vast fortune? 20 million was only part of it. There was a lot more. Well, they invested a lot in the stock market and may have triggered the crash of 29, I don't know. Because like a week or so before the crash, that wasn't Black Friday. That was Black Monday, I think. A week or so before the crash, he figured it out. He figured out that the market was gonna go. And he ordered all of their assets sold, many millions of dollars of stock sold immediately. And it was all sold, all converted to cash. And then Black Monday came, and the brokerage that had all the cash went out of business and made off with the cash. So there's where a lot of the money went. It's interesting how a vast fortune can be dispersed. And I'm actually writing a book about all this. But this is an overview. They decided something else needed to be done with that money. As the 30s wore on and the Depression, they determined that there would be a war and that it was going to be bad and that we might not win it. And looking back now, that seems unlikely, but at the time, the Allies didn't know who they were going to fight. Each other? Germany? It was a very ununited time. And things were very dark. The Axis forces were much better organized and so much more efficient in their techniques that there was a good chance of losing it. Certainly losing Britain was obviously almost happened. So they decided they needed some protection from all this, and they would build in the hills of Los Angeles. They were living in Pasadena at the time, and they owned a whole block of downtown Pasadena, lots of other things, but they decided, okay, we're going to build a retreat up in the hills of Pacific Palisades at a place called Murphy Ranch. They bought some property from Jesse Murphy up there, and they got the famous black architect Paul Williams to design a big estate there, a great big house with an indoor swimming pool, and among other things was a power house which generated all the electricity they needed, a 20,000 gallon fuel oil tank, a 300,000 gallon water tank. They terraced the hillsides and put in fruit trees all up and down, and to this day there are 8 concrete staircases that go up and down these hillsides, and the longest is over 500 steps long. And it's kind of an interesting thing in Los Angeles. But this was to be the retreat when everything got bad. And I think it was shortly after Christmas in 1941, they pulled the kids out of school and they moved to that compound. And this was at a time when my uncle tells the story of watching American bombers bomb a Japanese submarine, American fighter planes bomb a Japanese submarine off Redondo Beach on Christmas Day of 1941. So it was a different time. At night, everyone had to shut off all the lights, so that any aerial attack could not see Los Angeles below it. It's kind of amazing that they could even try to shut off all the light from Los Angeles. But the retreat, was a relatively safe place, I suppose. They went through the war there. Norman went on. During the war, Norman wanted to support he saw which side was good and bad, clearly enough. And he wanted to support the United States, and he went to work for Douglas Aircraft. And he eventually became head of the testing department for the fighter planes. And he told me a vivid story about hoisting, they had them hoist an airplane up, one of the planes that lands on the carrier ships, hoist it 30 feet in the air and drop it on the concrete floor of the facility. You can't do that. Those planes cost thousands of dollars. What are you talking about? You've got to do it. And you knew my grandfather. Do it. Take it up there and drop it. And they did, and they discovered exactly what was going to happen to that plane when it tried to land on a carrier ship with the wind buffeting it out at sea. And he actually designed a bracket. He was an engineer and designed a bracket to hold the tail on better, and received a commendation from the Secretary of the Navy for it at some point because it saved a lot of planes. So there he was working for Douglas Aircraft. My grandmother arranged a deferment for her oldest son on an agricultural basis. And when Army inspectors came out to check this out, he met them at the gate and said, "Take me with you." "I want to go. I don't want a deferment. Sign me up." And so he found himself in the Army, and he was with Patton's Army marching into Germany as part of World War II. And my Uncle Robin, also, these all grew up on the property there. Norman Winona Stevens' children, Dale, Robin, Carlisle, and Theanne. Robin joined the Merchant Marine and went to Asia and fought, was not really fought, but in the Merchant Marine, at least he was protecting ships. And
there was a lot of hard work on the property. They didn't want to stay there.
Well, also they were hard-working kids, I'll tell you. Running up and down those stairs, taking care of all the terraced olive trees and lemon trees and things like that. It was a lot of work. But that's what happened during World War II with my family. And when it was over, in 48 or 49, they sold the property to Huntington Hartford. He was a kind of a playboy millionaire from the A&P market fortune. He turned it into an art colony. And that eventually faltered, and it was sold to the County of Los Angeles. And to this day, it's a park, public park of sorts, off in the hills of Los Angeles. So the old buildings are there in ruins because a fire swept through a long time ago, but still they were very substantial buildings. Murphy Ranch. And it's covered with graffiti. Well, sometime in the 80s, one of the neighbors who had lived near Murphy Ranch, a woman who had started writing books about the history of Pacific Palisades, she told her son that, there were Nazis that lived on that property. I don't know where this idea came from, but it must have been born out of the paranoia of World War II, that somehow she was convinced that Nazis were living there, and she had no evidence whatsoever, but her son became also a local historian, promoted the story because everybody loves particular kinds of nonsense. So when this nonsense got out there, we said, "Nazis, tell me more." And so he made up more about it. He didn't have any evidence, he didn't have any standing in history, and he spelled Stevens wrong when he put their names in, but he called Norman Winona Stevens Nazi sympathizers, spelled with a PH, which is why I never found this until this year, because their name is spelled with a V. I'd Googled their names and found lots of interesting things, but never found this. But now, all over Los Angeles, it's a widely known story in Los Angeles. There was a Nazi enclave north of Los Angeles. It's been in the Los Angeles Times twice over the years. Nobody did any decent research. They couldn't even get the names right. They didn't know who lived there. And yet, everybody was perfectly willing to believe this nonsense story. And they have a story that Herr Schmidt lived on the property. And that the day after Pearl Harbor, the FBI swept in and arrested Herr Schmidt and took him away. How did they come up with that? So, it's as usual, when I read something in the paper, when I actually know what the story is really about, they've got it all wrong. I've seen that so many times. The press, you can't trust the press. I don't know, they're too busy to research things and get it right, I guess. But they got this one wrong. And needless to say, my Uncle Dale has passed on, but my Uncle Robin and my father are both upset about this and want to do something about it. They would like the story corrected. So what do you do? When you have this kind of nonsense out there calling your family Nazis? What can I do about that? That's ridiculous. I could write a letter, we could all write letters to the Los Angeles Times, who's not going to be all that interested in admitting that they failed to research their story and slandered people. So I think the general approach to nonsense is the good approach is the one I'm going to use, which is light. You want to illuminate it. You want to pour the light into it, make everything clear. When you have some darkness, light is the antidote. And boy, people want to have some darkness there, but it's too bad because the light's coming. I'm going to put out a book, maybe a TV show if I can enlist somebody to help me with that makes it absolutely clear what really went on there. And the fascinating thing, we were talking about how stories don't really reflect reality. The actual reality of what happened there, I think in many ways is more interesting than a cooked up Herr Schmidt. Because there were some interesting things that happened there too that, you know, Norman and Winona were vastly wealthy people. And in that they were kind of like another wealthy couple, the Tsar and Tsar Nicholas of Russia, in one thing that happened to them. You know, Rasputin was involved with the Tsar in Russia, healed their child. And that's how he became so powerful and could do no wrong there in the court. Well, my Uncle Robin, when he was just little, he's 4 or 5 years old, he had impetigo all over his skin. And they took him everywhere. They couldn't find anything that would help him. They took him to Christian Science, people who would pray. And this poor kid was just really sick with this. And along came this fellow named Conrad Anderson, who had a reputation as a mystical person with all kinds of powers. And they brought him into the family to say, well, can you help us? And he looked at Robin and he waved his hand over him. He said, in 3 days, all the sores will be gone. And they were. So he could do no wrong. And he immediately took on the Rasputin role in the family and subverted the family in so many different ways. It was really a sad story in a lot of ways. The kids were mistreated in some ways, and he threatened them. He said, if you don't do what I say, a Leela will come, a spaceship, this is the word for a Leela will come and take you away to my laboratory. You'll never see your parents again. And of course, my dad, he was just a little kid, and he took it seriously, and it's a scary thing. They put them through all kinds of purification and training ritual type things that were not appropriate for kids at all. And the whole, we think some of the things that people do these days, along the lines of, New Age gone wild, they did all that stuff back then too, everybody's got to have their colonics, right? Things like that, it's just crazy stuff. And he eventually died in 46, I think it was, and I'm getting all these dates and everything straightened out for the book. But he died in a very strange way, Conrad Anderson. He apparently burned up. He would spent the last few months of his life in a bathtub full of ice water with ice cubes in it, because to him it was as if his skin was on fire. And the coroner said he'd never seen anything like it. So when somebody messes around with powers that they really are not using well, those kind of things can happen. And that's what happened to Conrad Anderson. So it's quite a story. And the book is going to be about these things that are fascinating. And I guess I confess I'm going to capitalize on people's fascination with Nazis too, and sell some truth based on it. But the last, maybe third of the book is going to be about what Norman did with the last part of his life, which is the creation of the Rainbow Bridge books, the meditation groups, the working with the Devas, the great Deva over the San Onofre nuclear power plant that they worked with. That's a fascinating story. Groups that started all over the country based on those teachings, and we have a group in Port Townsend. There are groups still existing all over that follow those meditation techniques. And really, in 1975, when that book came out, it was one of the forerunning books of the New Age movement. So I'm going to fight this nonsense with the best information I have and put that out there. I guess there are some other things about this. You'll have to wait and read the book if you want all the juicy details about this strange story of my grandparents.
What are you going to call it?
A working title is Nazi Nonsense in Los Angeles. But I think it might. Yeah, I think it might sell with that title. But on the other hand, it's going to also be a spiritual book in disguise. And I don't know if I want the word Nazi in the title of my book that's going to introduce people to the Rainbow Bridge, So, kind of torn on the title. So I'm working on it this year. It's coming out. And you're the first people in the public to hear about it. So I want to wrap up with making some statements of non-nonsense. We talk a lot about nonsense, exposed to so much of it. Let me just say some things that I think, and that I've, from Lawrence and the things I've learned, that I think are not nonsense at all. good things that I value. And by the way, the talk is over in about 10 minutes, 5:30, but I'll stay on if you have any questions. I love discussing all these things. So, first of all, we're all in this together. And any action we take that is only for ourselves is ultimately just preparation for broader action on behalf of everybody. That is our destiny, to serve everyone. And when we prepare ourselves, we're preparing for that. In the next kingdom beyond human, we know and experience the unity, the desire to serve all. We experience that directly. And there is never again any question of the purity of motive. We do everything in full awareness of our unity with everything. An interesting aspect of that unity is that we can then be trusted with tremendous powers that we certainly can't be trusted with as human beings. But the power to overcome any situation in this world becomes ours when we can be trusted, because we do serve everyone. The more we focus on what is real, which is us, consciousness evolving in us, not all the things, the people and the relationships are what's really real here. The more we focus on that, the less power illusion and deception have over us. The more honest we are, the more truth we encounter. All the esoteric teachings, and good religious teachings for that matter, agree that our goal is unity. And this repeats what I've said, but the people who show the way make it clear that our unlimited selves, our eventual fully blossomed selves, serve all and know themselves to be one with all. At the same time, let's not get discouraged by such big ideals as being completely unselfish and serving everybody. We can't just jump straight to that. The direction is clear, though. That's where we're going. If we just bring in love for everyone, to whatever degree that we can, we will be moving in the right direction. We need to recognize all the subtle forms of hatred out there, because what's not love is a form of hatred. Recognize them, those things that divide us, that make us antagonistic with each other, and make sure that we don't take part in them. Our own happiness is a service to others. It's a way of giving. An unhappy person is a burden to others. So Lawrence actually says we have a duty to be happy. We are what's real. We are what's real in any situation. We are indestructible. So everything else of form is temporary. So let's focus on what's real and indestructible. You are loved, individually and as a whole. Listen for that love, especially when it tells you not to text when you're driving. God, or divine consciousness, manifests in you, through you, as us. We're not really separate from it. The laws of sowing and reaping provide perfect justice for all, and they're never arbitrary. There's no biblical arbitrary God stuff really going on. We just plant the seeds for good, trust life, knowing that we will finish harvesting all the old bad stuff eventually, and move on to harvesting the results of all the good seeds we've planted. That's the transition we're going through. Maybe there's some old stuff coming our way. We have to be stoic about it and get through it, and be looking forward to harvesting the good seeds we're planting now. We will succeed in overcoming all the suffering and difficulties of the human kingdom, and it gets much better after that. The human kingdom is a tough place, really. I shouldn't even say that. Human kingdom is the Garden of Eden, and we're not recognizing it. All right. It doesn't have to be bad now. It is what we make it. So, In the spirit of nonsense and good things at the same time, I want to close with a quote that isn't by Nelson Mandela. Even though everything said it was out there on the internet for a long time, because it's such a beautiful quote, and it really is true to his spirit, and since he's just moved on recently, I thought that that was appropriate. It's really by Marianne Williamson. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. Our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And we let our own light shine. As we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. Thank you.